Before the arrival of European settlers, the Cherokee people lived in harmony with the land, deeply connected to the spirits that roam the forests, rivers, and mountains. The Smoky Mountains, with their dense mists and ancient trees, were sacred to them, guarded by both benevolent and vengeful forces. But everything changed with the forced relocation of the Cherokee during the Trail of Tears, a dark chapter in history that left behind scars not only on the people, but on the land itself. In the wake of this tragedy, stories began to emerge, haunting tales passed down through generations. Legends of spirits, curses, and supernatural vengeance became woven into the fabric of Cherokee folklore. Among the most chilling of these tales is the story of Tsali, a man whose defiance against the U.S. government led to his death, but whose legacy lingers in the darkest corners of the Smoky Mountains. These stories, born from suffering and survival, are more than just tales. They are warnings. Warnings of what happens when the past is not honored and the spirits of the mountains are disturbed. Here, we explore 5 such stories, each more terrifying than the last, beginning with the legend of Tsali's blood sacrifice and the horrors that followed. Story 1: The Blood of the Tsali. The wind howled through the ancient trees of the Smoky Mountains as Tsali led his family deeper into the wilderness, the ground beneath their feet growing uneven and treacherous. The once sacred land they called home had turned hostile, much like the world around them. The U.S. soldiers were close behind, hunting them down like animals. Tsali, his wife, their sons, and several other Cherokee families had managed to escape the initial roundup during the forced relocation, refusing to be marched west on the Trail of Tears. But there was no real escape from the soldiers' pursuit. The forest that once offered shelter now seemed to conspire against them, as though it too resented their defiance. As night fell, Tsali could feel the weight of his ancestors in the air, a pressure that clung to his skin and made the air dense with foreboding. His youngest son, Tsali, lagged behind, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion. "Father," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. "I saw something in the trees." Tsali turned, his eyes searching the darkness. His heart pounded as he scanned the dense foliage. They were miles away from the soldiers now, but the boy's fear was palpable, and Tsali had learned to trust such instincts. "What did you see, Tsali?" he asked, his voice calm but tense. "A man, but he wasn't alive." Tsali's words sent a chill down Tsali's spine. "Go to your mother," Tsali ordered, watching the boy rush to the side of his wife. He surveyed the trees one last time before they set up camp for the night, but all he could see were the shadows swaying in the moonlight, though the feeling of being watched lingered. As they settled around a small, carefully hidden fire, the atmosphere grew colder, not from the autumn chill, but from an unnatural presence in the air. Tsali's wife, Tsali, clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her eyes flicking nervously to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "The ancestors are restless tonight," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "They sense what we are about to face," Tsali responded quietly. "They know the soldiers are closing in." But even as Tsali spoke, there was something else gnawing at him. A feeling that they weren't just being pursued by men, but by something far older, something that lived within the heart of the mountains. That night, as the family lay down to rest, Tsali found sleep elusive. He kept his hand close to his knife, his eyes scanning the dark woods around them. It was during the deepest part of the night, when the world was eerily still, that he first heard it. A low, mournful wail, like the sound of wind caught in a hollow cave. The others stirred as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was no ordinary wind. It was the voice of something in pain, something ancient and angry. Tsali rose quietly, motioning for his sons to stay with their mother. As he moved toward the edge of the camp, the wail transformed into words, soft, indistinguishable at first, but soon clear as the syllables of his native tongue. "They demand blood." Tsali's breath caught in his throat. The voice was not coming from a person, but from the earth itself. It was the voice of the land, the spirits of the ancestors who had lived here long before him. Tsali fell to his knees, pressing his hand into the dirt, hoping to feel some connection, some explanation for this haunting voice. The ground beneath him felt cold, too cold for the season. Then, just as suddenly as the voice had come, it stopped, leaving only a deafening silence in its wake. As Tsali rose to his feet, his eyes adjusted to the moonlight filtering through the trees. He saw them, faint, spectral figures drifting between the trunks. Cherokee warriors, women, and children, long dead, their bodies ravaged by disease, starvation, and violence, staring at him with hollow eyes. They were the victims of betrayal, the ones who had been led away from their lands, the ones who had perished in the wilderness. Their skin was pale and translucent, their mouths open as though locked in eternal screams. "They demand blood," the voice came again, this time from the mouths of the ghosts. Tsali's heart raced. He knew what it meant. The ancestors were not at peace. They demanded retribution for the wrongs done to them, for the betrayal that had led to their suffering. But whose blood did they demand? Suddenly, a cry shattered the night. Tsali whirled around to see that Datsi was gone. His wife was screaming, her voice piercing the night as she frantically searched for their son. The others joined in the desperate search, but it was as though the boy had vanished into thin air. Tsali ran through the forest, his breath ragged, calling out his son's name. And then he saw it, the figure of a child standing on the edge of a cliff, silhouetted by the pale light of the moon. But as Tsali drew closer, he realized with horror that it was not his son. It was a spirit, an ancient child long dead, staring at him with empty eyes. "They demand blood," it whispered before vanishing into the night. And so it began. One by one, Tsali's family started disappearing, swallowed by the vengeful spirits of the forest, until Tsali was left alone, haunted by the echoes of his people's suffering. He understood now. The ancestors would not rest until they were avenged, and Tsali himself would have to be the one to deliver the blood they sought. But whose blood would it be? Story 2. The Curse of the Smoky Mountains. Years after Tsali's fateful sacrifice, the Smoky Mountains remained haunted by the memory of his final act. Those Cherokee who had remained, spared from the trail of tears by Tsali's surrender, began to realize that the land they had fought so hard to protect was no longer the refuge it once was. The mountains, once filled with the whispers of the spirits of their ancestors, had turned dark and foreboding, as though the very earth had absorbed the pain of their people and transformed into something malevolent. The first sign of the curse came in the form of sickness. At first it was subtle, a fever here, a cough there, but soon entire families were stricken with a wasting illness that no medicine could cure. The elders who had lived through the worst horrors of the forced relocation began to speak of Tsali and his sons. They believed that the spirits of the mountains had turned against them, that Tsali's sacrifice had not brought peace, but had instead awakened something far more sinister. "Tsali died for us," the elders would say, their voices heavy with guilt. "But the mountains demand more." One night, during a particularly harsh winter, a young boy named Galvdi went missing from his village. His mother had tucked him in by the fire, and when she awoke the next morning, the fire was cold, and Galvdi's bed was empty. The villagers searched for him, calling his name into the wind, but there was no trace of the boy. The elders warned that it was the curse of the Smoky Mountains. They believed that the spirits, unsatisfied with Tsali's blood, had begun to claim the lives of those who had stayed behind, punishing them for surviving when so many others had perished. It wasn't long before others began to disappear. A young woman, known for her beauty and kindness, was found wandering the woods late one night, her eyes vacant, her skin pale and clammy. She had no memory of where she had been or how she had come to be lost, but when she spoke, her voice was no longer her own. She spoke in the voice of the mountains, low, mournful, and filled with anger. The sacrifice was not enough, she said, her words chilling the hearts of those who heard her. The land is hungry. It will take what it is owed. As the weeks passed, the villagers began to see strange figures moving through the mist at dawn and dusk. These shadowy forms, tall and gaunt, seemed to watch them from the ridges of the mountains, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The elders knew these figures were not human. They were the spirits of the dead, the ones who had perished during the Trail of Tears, their bodies never properly buried, their souls never at rest. "They are waiting," one elder said, her voice trembling with fear. "They are waiting for us to pay the debt." In the years that followed, the sickness grew worse, and the disappearances became more frequent. The Cherokee who remained in the mountains found themselves living in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, always listening for the soft whispers of the spirits in the wind. The once vibrant community was now a shadow of its former self, haunted by the memory of Tsali's sacrifice and the curse that had followed. The mountains, once their protector, had turned into a prison. The people could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on them, watching their every move, waiting for the moment when they too would be claimed by the curse. It was said that on certain nights when the moon was high and the wind was still, the ghost of Tsali could be seen walking through the trees, his face etched with sorrow, his eyes filled with the knowledge of the curse he had unwittingly unleashed. Some claimed they had heard his voice on the wind, whispering words of warning to those who ventured too deep into the forest. "Stay away," the wind would whisper. "The mountains demand more blood." And so, the people of the Smoky Mountains lived in fear, knowing that the curse of Tsali would never be lifted, that the spirits of the ancestors, betrayed and forgotten, would haunt the land forever, until the debt was paid in full. But by then it would be too late. Story 3. The Wailing Winds of Oconaluftee. The Valley of Oconaluftee had always been a place of deep spiritual significance for the Cherokee people. Nestled in the heart of the Smoky Mountains, it was once a haven of tranquility, a place where elders would share stories around the fire, where children would play in the river, and where the great warriors of the tribe would come to commune with the spirits of their ancestors. But that was before the wailing began. It started one autumn night when the winds first carried the low, mournful cries down through the valley. The Cherokee of Oconaluftee, who were used to the soft whispers of the forest, immediately sensed something different. The wind seemed heavier, burdened with sorrow and suffering, as if it had passed through the deepest chambers of the underworld before reaching their ears. At first, the villagers thought it was a trick of the wind, just the sound of leaves rustling through the trees in a particularly strange way. But the wailing returned the next night, and the night after that. Every night without fail, the cries would come, starting low, like the distant sound of a woman weeping, before rising into a cacophony of screams. And the voices, they were not just the sounds of the wind anymore. The Cherokee could hear words in the wailing, though they were garbled, mixed with the unmistakable sobs of mothers and the agonized screams of men. It was the unmistakable sound of death, of suffering that transcended time. One elder, known as Tsali, who had survived the Trail of Tears as a child, was the first to understand the true horror of what was happening. The wailing was not just a noise carried by the wind. It was the voices of the dead, the voices of those who had died during the forced marches west, whose bodies had never been properly buried, whose souls were left to wander, trapped between this world and the next. "They are the ones who were forgotten," Tsali whispered one night, sitting by the fire as the wailing wind swept through the village again. His face was etched with sorrow, his eyes glassy with age and terrible knowledge. Their spirits walked the Trail of Tears forever, and now they've come back to us. No one wanted to believe Tsali at first. Surely these were just stories, ghost tales meant to frighten children. But when one of the younger men in the village, a hunter named Kanuna, ventured into the valley at night to prove that it was all just superstition, things began to change. Kanuna was a skeptic, a proud young warrior who believed that the old tales were merely the remnants of a time long past. He would be the one to show them that the wailing was nothing more than the wind, nothing supernatural at all. He left the village just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the last traces of light fading into twilight. As he entered the valley, the wind picked up, swirling around him with a strange intensity. Kanuna held his bow tightly, scanning the trees with sharp eyes, daring the wind to reveal its secrets. But as the night deepened and the wailing began, Kanuna felt an unsettling sensation crawling up his spine. The sound wasn't just the wind. He could hear it now, the distinct cries of women, of children, of warriors like him. Their voices pierced the air, carried on the breeze, and they were unmistakable. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and for a brief moment it seemed to gather itself, swirling in a tight circle around Kanuna. The wails grew louder, surrounding him. He heard his name, Kanuna, whispered on the wind, as though the dead themselves were calling out to him. His heart began to race as he felt the pressure of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. And then, in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Men, women, and children. Their bodies translucent, pale and twisted with suffering. Their eyes were wide, hollow, and filled with an eternal pain that Kanuna could feel burning into his soul. They didn't move like living beings. They drifted through the trees, their feet not touching the ground, their mouths open in silent screams that echoed on the wind. Kanuna froze, his instincts telling him to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He tried to draw his bow, to at least defend himself, but as he did, one of the figures, a woman with long matted hair and hollow eyes, stepped forward. She moved toward him with agonizing slowness, her mouth stretched open in a soundless scream. Kanuna could feel her sorrow, her fear, her rage, emotions so powerful that they seemed to consume him from the inside out. Before he could react, she was upon him. Her icy hand reached out, brushing against his cheek, and suddenly the valley seemed to dissolve around him. Kanuna's vision blurred as the forest and mountains faded, replaced by something far more terrifying. He was no longer in Okonalufti. He was walking the Trail of Tears. The sky was gray, heavy with impending storm, and all around him he saw his people, thousands of them, walking with hollow expressions, their bodies weak and broken. They moved like shadows, their eyes vacant and filled with unspeakable sorrow. Children cried, their faces gaunt with hunger, while mothers tried in vain to comfort them. Elderly men and women collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies left behind to be claimed by the wilderness. And the soldiers, cruel, indifferent, marched alongside them, shouting commands, their faces obscured by the mist that seemed to choke the life from the air. Kanuna tried to scream, to break free from this horrific vision, but no sound escaped his throat. The cries of the dead surrounded him, growing louder and more unbearable with each step. His feet moved without his command, as though he was being pulled forward by some unseen force, doomed to walk this endless trail of death and despair. The wind howled in his ears, and just as quickly as the vision had come, it ended. Kanuna found himself back in the valley, his body drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The wailing had stopped. The figures were gone. But something had changed within him. He could still hear the faint echoes of the dead in his mind, their voices whispering to him, begging him for release. Kanuna stumbled back to the village at dawn, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't speak for days, not until Tsali came to him, sitting quietly beside him by the fire. Kanuna finally looked up, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting understanding. "They're still walking," he whispered. "They're still out there." From that night on, the people of Okonalufti knew that the valley was cursed. No one ventured out after sunset, for the wailing winds would always return. Every October, as the air grew colder and the nights longer, the cries of the dead intensified. The Cherokee understood now that the spirits of those who had died on the Trail of Tears would never rest, not until the wrongs committed against them had been righted. But how could they make peace with the dead when their suffering had been so great, their loss so immeasurable? As time passed, the stories of the wailing winds spread beyond the valley, carried on the whispers of those who had heard the cries for themselves. Travelers, settlers, even soldiers who dared to camp in Okonalufti reported hearing the same strange noises, the distant sound of a woman crying, the unmistakable wails of children in pain. Some who stayed too long in the valley claimed to have seen the ghostly figures, wandering the same paths as Kanuna had, their eyes filled with eternal suffering. The Cherokee knew that the spirits would never stop calling. The wailing winds would continue to carry the voices of the dead, forever trapped in the valley, until the earth itself swallowed them whole or someone found a way to bring them peace. But until then, Okonalufti would remain haunted by the voices of the past, the cries of a people who had suffered too much, too long, and whose souls would never rest. Story 4: Tsali's Sons and the Bone Collectors. The thick canopy of the Smoky Mountains was a natural shield, a dense curtain of trees and mist that hid secrets far older than the Cherokee people themselves. Tsali and his family had been among the last to hide within its folds when they fled the soldiers during the early days of the Trail of Tears. But it wasn't Tsali's death alone that haunted these woods. It was what became of his sons. The whispers among the Cherokee who remained in the mountains told of strange creatures that prowled the forest after dark, collecting the bones of the living and the dead, led by the restless spirits of Tsali's children. These were the Bone Collectors, and their story began with Tsali's final act of defiance. After Tsali and his family fled into the mountains, pursued by the U.S. soldiers, Tsali's sons, Junaluska and Little Deer, were the first to fall victim to the forest's supernatural wrath. Tsali himself had been captured and executed, his sacrifice meant to save others, but the price for the family's defiance had been steep. His sons, though brave warriors, had vanished one by one into the mist-shrouded wilderness, their bodies never recovered. Some said they had been taken by the soldiers, but others whispered that something far worse had claimed them. Years later, the Cherokee who remained in the mountains began to speak of strange occurrences in the deepest parts of the forest. Hunters would return with wild stories of eerie figures glimpsed through the fog, figures that were neither fully human nor fully spirit. These were tall, gaunt creatures, their faces hidden beneath matted hair, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. But it wasn't just their appearance that terrified those who saw them. It was what they carried. The Bone Collectors were so named for the gruesome task they seemed to carry out in the shadows of the mountains. The hunters who dared venture into the areas where Tsali's sons were last seen would stumble upon scenes of unimaginable horror, the remains of animals and sometimes humans, scattered through the underbrush, their bones picked clean of flesh. But these weren't just the bodies of those who had died from natural causes, or even from the violence of the soldiers. No, these bones bore strange markings, deep, unnatural cuts as though they had been meticulously harvested, torn from their owners with a cruel, deliberate precision. The elders of the tribe knew what these signs meant. The forest had been tainted by blood, Tsali's blood, and the blood of all the Cherokee who had perished in the mountains, abandoned by the world. The land had grown hungry, and it was no longer content to merely watch. It demanded something in return for the lives it had taken. And so, it sent out the Bone Collectors, led by the spirits of Tsali's lost sons, cursed to wander the mountains, driven by an insatiable thirst for vengeance. One of the earliest and most terrifying encounters with the Bone Collectors occurred when a group of young hunters, eager to prove their bravery, ventured deeper into the forest than anyone had dared to go in years. They had heard the old stories, of course, the legends of Tsali and his sons, but they were just that, stories. Ghost tales meant to keep children from straying too far into the woods. These young men had no fear of such things. They believed in the power of their skill with a bow and their knowledge of the land. They were sure nothing in the forest could threaten them. It was late in the evening when they set up camp by a small stream, the air growing cool with the setting sun. As they laughed and boasted of their hunting prowess, one of the hunters, a young man named Adahi, noticed something strange. Across the stream, where the trees grew thick and twisted, he saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and hunched over, as if its bones were too large for its skin. The figure didn't move like a man. It lurked in the shadows, barely visible in the dying light. But Adahi could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. He didn't say anything to the others at first, thinking it was a trick of the light or his imagination playing tricks on him after a long day of hunting. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The wind stirred the trees in a way that felt unnatural, as though the forest itself was alive and restless. And then the wailing began. At first it was a low sound, like the distant moan of the wind through the trees. But soon it grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices rising in agony. It wasn't the sound of animals or even the natural hum of the forest. It was the sound of people crying out in pain, their voices echoing through the trees as though they were trapped between life and death. The hunters grew still, their laughter dying on their lips as the wailing filled the night air. Adahi stood, his hand gripping his bow tightly as he scanned the darkened forest. The others followed his lead, drawing their weapons and straining their ears. trying to make sense of the strange sound. And then they saw it emerging from the trees like ghosts from a nightmare. The bone collectors, there were 4 of them, their skeletal frames draped in tattered remnants of clothing, their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness, their mouths open in silent screams. But it wasn't just their appearance that struck fear into the hearts of the hunters, it was what they carried. In their long, bony hands, the bone collectors held the remains of their victims. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all meticulously cleaned, the flesh long since stripped away. The bones were arranged in strange patterns, woven into necklaces, held in bundles as though they were prized possessions. The bone collectors moved with eerie, unnatural grace, their feet barely touching the ground as they glided toward the camp. Adai felt his heart race as one of the collectors fixed its glowing eyes on him. He could see the bones it carried in its hands, small, delicate, like the bones of a child. The collector raised its hand, holding the bones out toward him as though offering them. But Adai knew better. This was no offering. It was a warning. The bone collectors were not here to give. They were here to take. Before Adai could react, the collector let out a bone-chilling scream, and the others followed suit, their voices blending into the same agonized wails that had filled the forest earlier. The hunters scrambled, trying to flee, but the bone collectors were faster, moving through the trees like shadows. One by one, the hunters fell, their bodies disappearing into the darkness, their screams cut short by the silence of the forest. Adai ran as fast as his legs could carry him, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the bone collectors behind him, their cold breath on the back of his neck, their skeletal hands reaching for him. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the forest where the village lights flickered in the distance. When Adai finally stumbled into the village, he was a shell of the man he had been. His clothes were torn, his face pale with fear, and his eyes wild with terror. He couldn't speak of what he had seen, of what had happened to his friends. But the villagers knew. They had heard the stories of the bone collectors, the cursed spirits of Tsali's sons, and they knew that the forest had claimed more lives. From that night on, no one ventured into the deeper parts of the mountains. The bone collectors were real, and they were hungry. Their work was never done, for the mountains were full of the bones of those who had died in violence, of those who had been taken before their time. The collectors were driven by a dark, insatiable need to gather what had been lost, to reclaim the bones of the forgotten dead, and ensure that the suffering of the past would never be forgotten. And Tsali's sons, they led the collectors, cursed to walk the earth forever, their spirits bound to the forest by their father's sacrifice. They were no longer the proud warriors they had once been. Now they were something else, something far more terrifying. They were the bone collectors, and they would never rest. Even now, the Cherokee who live near the Smoky Mountains tell stories of the bone collectors. On quiet nights, when the wind is still and the mist rolls in from the trees, they say you can hear the faint sound of bones clattering in the darkness. It's a warning, a reminder that the past is never truly dead, that the spirits of the mountains are always watching, always waiting. And if you ever see the bone collectors in the distance, standing at the edge of the forest with their glowing eyes and skeletal hands, know this: they are not here to offer peace. They are here to take what is owed. They are here to collect. Story 5. The Dark Watchers of the Ridge. The high ridges of the Smoky Mountains were always cloaked in mist, a shroud that seemed to shift and breathe with a life of its own. The Cherokee who lived in the shadow of these mountains believed that the ridges were sacred places where the spirits of their ancestors lingered, watching over the land. But over time, the presence on those ridges changed. The stories that began to circulate were no longer of benevolent guardians, but of dark figures, silent, motionless, and foreboding, who watched from the heights with eyes that burned through the fog. The Cherokee called them the Nunahai, meaning the immortals in their language, beings who once protected the land and the people. But there were others, shadowy figures that came later, after the violence and the suffering of the Trail of Tears. These figures were not the friendly spirits of old. They were known simply as the Dark Watchers, silent sentinels that haunted the ridges, watching without emotion or pity. Those who saw them knew that they had glimpsed something beyond the realm of the living. It was said that if you ever saw the Dark Watchers on the ridges, standing like statues against the sky, it meant that death was near. They did not interfere with the living, but their presence alone was an omen. And once you saw them, they would continue to watch you even after you left the mountains. The Cherokee who ventured too close to the ridges would sometimes return, pale and shaken, speaking of strange figures they had seen in the distance, dark and unmoving. Some claimed that the Watchers followed them back into their dreams, standing at the foot of their beds waiting. The legend of the Dark Watchers was one that every child in the village heard growing up, passed down from generation to generation. But no one had ever truly believed the stories. At least, not until the summer of 1855, when a group of loggers from a nearby settlement began clearing land in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. The logging operation was led by a man named Henry Timmons, a gruff and determined foreman who had little patience for superstition. To him, the stories of ghosts and spirits that the Cherokee shared were nothing more than tales meant to keep outsiders from encroaching on their land. He didn't believe in spirits or curses. He believed in hard work and progress. But as the logging crew began felling trees deeper into the forest, the unease among his men grew. It started with strange sightings. One of the men, a young logger named Matthew, was the first to mention seeing something unusual on the ridges. It had been early morning, just before dawn, when Matthew had risen from his tent to relieve himself. As he looked up toward the high ridges, where the first light of the sun was just beginning to break through the mist, he saw them, dark, unmoving figures, standing side by side along the crest of the ridge. They were distant, but their presence was undeniable. At first, Matthew thought they might be other men from the crew, but something about the way they stood, perfectly still and silent, sent a chill down his spine. He called out to them, but they didn't respond. When he squinted to get a better look, the figures seemed to fade into the mist, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. When Matthew returned to the camp, pale and shaken, the other men laughed at his story, dismissing it as nothing more than his imagination playing tricks on him in the early morning light. But over the next few days, others began to see the figures too. They would be working in the forest, chopping down trees or moving logs, when they would glance up at the ridges and see them, always standing in the same place, dark silhouettes against the sky. The men began to whisper about the Dark Watchers, the legendary figures the Cherokee spoke of. Some of the older loggers who had grown up hearing the stories warned the others not to look too long at the figures on the ridge. They believed that the Watchers were there for a reason, and that anyone who caught their attention would soon find themselves marked. But Henry Timmons, the foreman, refused to listen. He was a practical man, and he didn't believe in spirits or omens. He brushed off the concerns of his crew, insisting that the figures they were seeing were nothing more than shadows or tricks of the light. He pushed the men harder, driving them to clear more land and fell more trees, ignoring the growing sense of dread that seemed to settle over the camp like a heavy fog. One night, as the crew gathered around the fire, a Cherokee man named Wyatt came to the camp. He was an elder from a nearby village, and he had heard about the logging operation. He stood before the fire, his face etched with lines of age and worry, and he warned Timmons and his men to stop what they were doing. "You are cutting into sacred land," Wyatt said, his voice low and grave. "The ridges are watched by the spirits of the dead. The Dark Watchers will not allow this." Timmons laughed, shaking his head. "I don't believe in your ghosts," he said dismissively, "and I don't believe in curses. This land is ours now, and we'll do what we please with it." Wyatt looked at Timmons with pity in his eyes. "You may not believe in them," he said, "but they believe in you." The elder left the camp, his warning hanging in the air like the mist that clung to the trees. That night, the wind howled through the forest, and the air grew cold, colder than it should have been in the middle of summer. The men huddled in their tents, uneasy but unwilling to voice their fears. The next morning, when the sun rose, the first thing they saw were the Watchers, dozens of them, lining the ridge above the camp, dark and foreboding. This time they were closer than before, their outlines clearer, sharper. The men felt the weight of their gaze, an invisible pressure that pressed down on them, filling their chest with dread. It was as if the very air had turned heavy, suffocating them with fear. Timmons tried to rally the men, insisting that they ignore the watchers and get back to work. But as the day wore on, the unease grew. Tools began to go missing, and strange sounds echoed through the forest. Footsteps that didn't belong to any man in the camp, whispers carried on the wind. At night, the men could hear movement just beyond the light of their fires, as though something was circling their camp, watching, waiting. And the watchers never left. Every morning they stood on the ridges, silent and unmoving, their presence a constant reminder of the curse that hung over the forest. It wasn't long before the first man disappeared. His name was Samuel, a quiet man who had been with the crew for years. One morning he simply wasn't there. His bedroll was empty, his tools left behind. The men searched the forest calling his name, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The next night another man vanished, and then another. By the time the third man disappeared, the crew was in a state of panic. They refused to work, too afraid to go into the forest. Timmons, desperate to keep the operation running, led a search party into the woods, determined to find his missing men and prove that there was nothing supernatural at play. They searched for hours, combing through the dense underbrush and calling out the names of the missing men. But as they climbed higher up the ridge, the forest grew darker, the air colder. The mist that had always lingered in the Smoky Mountains seemed thicker here, almost alive, swirling around them in ghostly tendrils. And then they found them, the missing men. But they weren't alive. The bodies were laid out in a clearing, their limbs twisted and broken, their eyes wide open in terror. But it wasn't the sight of the bodies that sent a wave of cold fear through the search party. It was the fact that they weren't alone. The Dark Watchers were there, standing in a perfect circle around the bodies, their dark forms blending into the mist. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched. Timmons fell to his knees, the weight of the Watchers' gaze crushing him. He finally understood. The land wasn't his to take. It had never been his. The Watchers had been there long before him, and they would be there long after. They were the guardians of the mountains, silent and eternal, and they would not allow anyone to disturb the sacred ground. Timmons and the few men who survived fled the forest that night, abandoning the camp and the logging operation. They never returned. The Dark Watchers remained, their silent vigil unbroken, watching from the ridges as the mist swallowed the forest once more. And to this day, the Cherokee say that the Dark Watchers are still there, standing on the ridges, waiting. They do not interfere with the living, but their presence is a reminder, a warning to those who would dare to disturb the ancient land. The Watchers see all, and when they come for you, there is no escape. They are always watching,